afternoon. I want to welcome everyone today. Thanks very much for joining the sixth and final public listening session of the Early Years Climate Action Task Force. Charged with drafting the Early Years Climate Action Plan for the U.S., you can find out more at either capita.org or thisisplaneted.org. This is the sixth and final in a series of listening sessions highlighting the particular vulnerabilities of young children to climate change and opportunities for early years sector and cross-sector partners to take action. Over the last 5 months, we have heard from parents and guardians, children, caregivers, pediatric healthcare providers, subject matter expert, and grassroots advocates. The task force work will also highlight the experiences of Indigenous and Native communities, people of color, those on low incomes, and those living in particularly climate vulnerable communities. We wish to gratefully acknowledge that the task force work is supported in part by the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation. Diana?
Thanks, Antoine. Today we have a timely panel to help us understand both how can we support parents and early year providers in advocating for a sustainable future, and how can we help parents in their challenge of carrying through supporting their children during this time. We will hear from a wonderful group of panelists, and we have a special guest joining us at the end of the session. We'll hear from each panelist, and then the task force members will be able to ask questions. We are joined by Lois Martin, the President Director of the Community Day Center for Children, Shaina Oliver, the State Coordinator for Moms Clean Air Force, and a tribal member of the Navajo Nation from Shiprock, New Mexico, also an advocate for Indigenous Peoples' Rights.
We're also joined by Anya Kamenetz, who is an advisor to the Aspen Institute on a new initiative to end climate silence in children media, authors of several acclaimed non-fictional books, and has covered education as a journalist for many years, including NPR, where she also co-created the podcast Life Kit, Parenting in Partnership with Sesame Workshop. We also have a very special guest. Chelsea Clinton is vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, working alongside the foundation's leadership and partners to improve lives and inspire emerging leaders across the United States and all around the world. She will offer closing remarks for today's sessions.
Thank you for joining us today, and we will begin with Lois.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to be here today to share a little bit about the work that I am doing along with some other groups around impacting the future for our children. I am, again, Lois Martin. I'm an early learning director based in the Central District of Seattle, and I have enjoyed learning besides children ages 12 to 60 months for over 30 years. It is my work with children and families that motivates me to advocate for a sustainable environment for our children. If we put in place policies that will protect them by ensuring that they have access to clean in and outdoor air, shade for places for them to be able to find that shade in those warm summer days that continue to grow warmer as climate change impacts us. And then we also gives them a chance to protect our neighborhoods. And one of the things that, I'm working on now and spending a lot of time talking about is the need to protect our urban forests. Because there is one thing that trees do, they're free and they're magical because they allow us to have access to the oxygen we need through their CO2 protections. And so one of the things that I know too, that in order for us to do this, we have to be able to find ways to have grants available. I think about myself of our childcare center between as I think most people know, in the Pacific Northwest where I am, we've had a lot more smoke come to our area from the north as well as from the eastern part of the state because of the increase in forest fires. There are a number of summers, and I've lived in Seattle majority of my life, where we actually are having to keep our children inside. And then that, including the record heat that we've had in Seattle, has resulted in I think it was in 2021, that we had to close to the parents for for 3 to 4 days because we simply could not have the children in our older building because of the heat. And what that does, it just not only keeps the children from being in a loving, nurturing environment where they have access to quality childcare, but it also impacts our area economically as parents were unable to go to work. And so for some of our frontline workers, our teachers, our doctors and nurses, that can really impact our entire community when things like that happen as we deal with climate change. In the Central District itself, and I had talked about the importance of urban forest canopy, we have lost a substantial amount of big trees that provide shade. Not only do they make it more comfortable to live, but they also help with cooling our homes and in providing an environment that supports the mental health while allowing our children to explore nature. There is a reason why outdoor preschools are successful in supporting children to develop their curiosity and investigative skills. Having access to trees allows children a chance to understand the importance of protecting our environment in order to slow climate change and create a sustainable planet. You know, we want to make sure that our children are not growing up in heat islands, and that it definitely happens more so in areas that are predominantly home to Black and brown people. So we have to make sure that we fight for that equitable investment that makes life better for us and not worse. We want to make sure that we are leaving our children with a future where they can grow and thrive and be able to be, as the mission of our center says, to grow into being capable adults who care about the environment and those around them. So I'm here today just to call for action and policies that support them, support our children, and make sure our planet continues to be a place where they can have wonderful lives.
Thank you, Lois. Shaina, we'll move to you.
Thank you for inviting me and giving me this platform to speak. Yes, I am a tribal member of the Navajo Nation. I am a mother of 4 and wife, family of 6. We've been living here in Denver, Colorado, where I'm a state coordinator with Moms Clean Air Force, as well as facilitating Eco Madres partnerships, working to support local communities. And how I got started was really, I always had this nagging feeling as a young person, but coming from the Native community, especially from the Navajo Nation, that it's not really a career choice that you make in going to environmental work or advocacy, or even being a lawyer, because a lot of people are like, that's a hard life to live, to be a lawyer or a teacher. In fact, that those are low-paying jobs that are not going to help support a family. But unfortunately, like a lot of us get moved into the labor force service, which is a lot of hours taken from families with little pay as well. And a lot of people have the misperception that a lot of hours means that you're doing something good, but not necessarily in the labor force. And being in Denver, Colorado, and away from the reservation, in 2015, the EPA had a toxic spill in the Animas River, and which leached into the San Juan River, which the Navajo Nation relied on that water source. And it became more of a nagging feeling to do something about the environment. My background's in accounting, and a lot of people told me, like, are you sure you're in the right field? And it was just because that perception from the community, from minorities that come from that, being in an environment doesn't pay the bills. But it really is a sacrifice being an advocate for things that people are not normally speaking about, especially on Indigenous Peoples' rights, our rights to to have access to clean air, water, and sustainable lands for the next future generations. And me having 4 kids, I really, through knowing moms and learning about moms networks, giving platforms to children that don't have a voice and that don't have a seat at the table, which many indigenous communities and tribal nations have not had that seat and representation at the table as well. But Moms Clean Air Force really like focused on children, which a lot of the times I never thought of speaking up for children, and especially for future generations, the unborn, maternal health, speaking up for those generations as well. They don't have a voice right now, but as mothers and as advocates, we could speak up for them right now and not wait anymore, because a lot of the times we waited to this point to do something about something. And for a long time, Indigenous communities have been impacted by Indian education through the boarding schools and the erasure of Indigenous identity. And we see that it's really important to bring back Indigenous knowledge back to our communities, especially language is one of those things that help us identify ourselves to our Native communities. And as well as there's many other Indigenous knowledge that needs to be shared, like food sovereignty. A lot of our communities are food deserts, and we've been stripped from our Indigenous knowledge of just knowing how to grow food and how to heal the soil, and know when enough is enough of usage of certain parts of resources, to the point that I'm recognizing gentrification, which wasn't really talked about like 10, 20 years ago among our communities. Like, we knew of it, but we just didn't really talk about it. That a lot of our communities are pushed into these environmental harmed areas where there's high industrial areas, a lot of diesel truck traffic along the highways. A lot of our housing is near these traffic areas, especially like along the highways. Those are our windy breeze that we get when we open our windows. And living here in Northeast Denver area is really highly impacted with air pollution, especially with the local industries like Suncor, Phillips 66, gas terminals, the XL gas energy plant, as well as the unknown Superfund sites that are being unearthed due to the highway expansion in this area that's being conducted, has really risen the health harms in this area, that we're seeing that women are still being impacted at greatly percentages compared to men. And a lot of men are holding our rights right now, especially in policy and legislation. And that's why I encourage young women to go for leadership, because we lack the women role in our political governance. That it is because this colonial governance had excluded women from the beginning, especially from Native communities and Native tribal governance, that we see less women in our leader roles, because they were excluded because the colonizers wouldn't speak to tribal nations if there was a woman in the room. And sharing that information with the younger generation inspires younger women to go for leadership now, and sharing that our governance is based on the forefathers looking to the savage nobles to build their governance that we utilize today. Being aware of that, like being an Indigenous person, a Native American in the US, and learning education, we've been stripped from a lot of things. And as well, knowing the resilience of our community, knowing the resilience of our governance came from our Indigenous governance, and stemmed through the friendship and peace treaty agreements that were held before federal governments were created. I see an opportunity with Indian education right now. We just opened American Indian Academy of Denver here in the metro area for Native students to be able to have access to traditional Indigenous knowledge, to be shared with them as well, to be advocates of their own education and where they want that to be. But unfortunately, we're going to be closing our doors at the end of the school years due to the lack of enrollment from the students. So it is being a ripple effect of the generations that are holding hostage of having kids because of the climate crisis is not being addressed. So we are feeling that in the state of Colorado, people having less children, and our enrollment has drastically declined in our schools. But we see still it's an important subject to be talked about, that Indian education as well as education period needs to be addressed, because a lot of mental health crises have increased in our children, especially student age, that we have increased suicides in our communities as Indigenous people, but not just Indigenous people, all people have been experiencing this in their communities. And then it really is going to come down to education. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you guys, because we need to educate our communities. Parents need to know that they can advocate for their students, especially the children that are going to be left with this community that we leave them with. And we need to better prepare them and to reinstill and acknowledge Indigenous knowledge. It still exists and can still be a pathway to solutions to this climate crisis that we're seeing, as well as mental wellness as well. Needs to be addressed, because that's a lot of what we talk about with Moms Clean Air Force. It's also mental wellness when we're talking about climate change. And we need to show the resilience of our communities over these decades, and that we can still exist, but we have to make sacrifices. And some of those sacrifices is going to be utilizing less resources and being mindful of our water usage, being mindful of what's being put in our water, as well as being mindful of what's being emitted in our air that we breathe, and making those connections of our health has a lot to do with the environment that we're placed in. So my health has been impacted with asthma since I was born. I was born in the mid 80s, so 1980s. So there was a heavy air pollution during that time. So I've been diagnosed with asthma since infancy. My youngest son, he was diagnosed with asthma last year, and he tends to get sick a lot. So those are some of the impacts that we feel in our community, is that we're seeing our community members seeing their children being diagnosed with asthma, and but yet their family have not been experienced to asthma before. So I see it's really important to have robust funding for our next generations, as well as tribal inclusion and robust funding for tribal nations, so that they can help bring these solutions to all communities. And we need to invite Black, Brown, and Indigenous educators to the table as well, to help reshape our education so that we can have a sustainable community, because education is the building blocks of our governance, our communities, and our law enforcement. So I see a lot of opportunity here. So thank you.
Thank you, Shaina. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. And finally, we're going to hear from Anya. I want to remind our task force members that we're going to have an open conversation after this. And if you could put questions in the chat, thank you, Angie, and others. We'll start with the questions in the chat, and then we'll have a conversation until our final speaker joins us at 12:50. So Anya, thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to my co-panelists for their really important perspectives. What I'm sharing here is really a sketch. I want to make sure that people, we're really just kind of at the beginning of how we think about the experiences of parents in enlisting parents of young children as partners for climate action. And I'm speaking as a parent of at least one younger child myself. My younger child is 6 years old. So, we've heard from a provider and from a parent who are activated on climate and who are engaged in action right now. But I really want us all to kind of imagine the experiences of a person who is not yet activated, someone who is worried about seasonal allergies impacting their child's asthma, who is worried about they're living in a manufactured home and they have high air conditioning bills coming to them this summer, or maybe they heard on the radio this morning about the latest IPCC report, and it's something that just makes them feel terrible and want to change the channel. It's a uniquely anxious time to become a parent right now, and there's emerging research showing that eco-anxiety is a factor in perinatal health for women, as well as in women's mental health, particularly as they think about their roles as becoming mothers. I'm sure there's going to be emerging research on men as well, but there's research right now, particularly for mothers. For our privileged sector of society, the eco-anxiety of parents is oftentimes channeled into kind of the symbolic actions that we take. Cloth diapering would be an example of this. Spend your money in a certain way, and that will help you deal with how worried you are about what kind of future your children are going to live in. And then, of course, for our frontline and fence line communities, living eco-anxiety is compounded by real, true danger, and having a child increases your experience of being exposed to climate risk, whether that be from a weather event, an acute weather event, a disruptive one like Hurricane Ida that we see here, or whether that be from a longer term weather event like increased heat. And so considering the basic needs that all parents have, and that they also have that on behalf of their children, need for safety, need for belonging, the need for our children to learn, the need for us to protect our children, the need for us to have hope on behalf of our children. The question is then, how can the people and organizations that are set up to support young children and the people who care for them be part of increasing climate resilience as part of a whole society effort? And I just have a slight sketch of a couple of ideas that might be able to help with that. And this is kind of a spectrum of things. Some of them are going to be very local and specific, and some of them are going to be richer and ongoing. So acute disaster resources, health and safety resources for ongoing climate risk, social and emotional support, really, really important for caregivers and for children. The foundations of climate literacy that we can support our parents in helping to develop in our children. And finally, how can these people and organizations, the early childhood sector, be the basis, create a basis for community and for action on climate. So just a sketch of thinking about what early climate literacy is and what it means, and how providers and pediatricians can support parents. You can think about things that are really already a part of high quality early childhood, right? So care of self and environment, basic Montessori principles, nature and outdoor play, every child deserves that. Building empathy for living things, building on our children's innate biophilia. Children love animals, they love living things. They can be encouraged to care for those things. Our building blocks of social and emotional well-being, the ways that we deal with difficult emotions and learn to co-regulate and self-regulate, part of early childhood. And then it just takes a little bit of work to do a climate lens on all of these activities and all of these values within quality early childhood settings. And of course, we need to increase access to quality early childhood settings. Some ideas and examples of concrete actions that make sense for the early childhood age range would include practicing saving water, saving energy, reducing food waste, lower emissions forms of transportation where that's possible for us. And then a simple neighborhood action like watering trees when it's hot, leaving out water for animals when it's hot, or perhaps clearing leaves from a storm drain before a storm. So how can we incorporate really easy, simple, concrete actions which expand the notion of care for the environment into the natural world and the surroundings that our children find ourselves in? Similarly, there is a great need for expanded health and safety efforts within the idea of local context to help our kids and help our parents prepare for both the acute and the ongoing climate risks. And that includes messages about sun safety, air quality safety, what to do when there's a large storm, perhaps the planning for disruptions that might cause a child to have to leave their home, and preparing them for that idea as well. So this could all be part of the early childhood basics. It's starting to be, it's emerging, but a lot of times, the best time to prepare these messages and practice them is before the emergency happens. And then thinking about, in a more broad sense, how pediatricians' offices, early childhood centers, in-home providers can be part of providing social emotional supports, strengthening community ties, and the foundation for action. Why am I putting all of these together? Because I really believe that in the climate space, they're all connected to each other. You know, we connect to each other to form communities, to join organizations. Connecting to each other helps us deal with the social and emotional impacts of climate anxiety. And beyond, you know, mental health resources and mental health support, what works for climate anxiety is climate action. So we don't have any response to climate anxiety without having real world actions that we're taking to actively engage in hope. And the image here that I'm presenting is taken from the work that reconnects, which is a group of experiential group work that helps build community and helps people move and connect their grief for the planet, their love for living things and the people that they love, and finally taking action. So, you know, there's a lot of different thoughts about parents being some of the most important groups in society to take climate action. They already are civically engaged. They already are more concerned than the average American. And the types of messages, this is from Families for a Future online surveys in 2022, the types of messages that really help with them are messages that build efficacy and push back against fatalism. Pushing it back against fatalism means that every little bit that we do will help. We have it in our hands to make the world a better place together. And then finally, highlighting tangible personal benefits. And there's no more tangible and personal benefits than those that my co-panelists mentioned, things like, you know, our child having a comfortable place to go to school, comfortable air to breathe, a walkable neighborhood. These are things that we can talk about in terms of how climate action will benefit us and our families and our children. And then how do we do that? We can build community through conversation. Some of the most likely climate actions, according to Climate Advocacy Lab, that parents said that they would be willing to take is to contact members of their community. And then almost half said, yes, I would organize an event or gathering around climate. And then similarly, as we're starting to explore with Aspen, a growing amount of research is supporting intergenerational climate conversations. The idea that educating and activating children on climate change will have spillover effects across their households. So just as a little bit of a provocation or an idea to think about, you know, those of you who have access to these kinds of childhood communities, could there be programming, two-generational programming, or programming that's parent engagement programming around what's called a climate cafe? And that is integrating and introducing all of these ideas, the idea of climate anxiety, what is it, how we combat it, what are the basis of climate literacy for our kids, what are the messages we're trying to pass on, what are the practical concerns in this region, and then moving that into the idea of climate action. How could our early childhood centers become the hubs for resilience, not only efficient, green, healthy spaces themselves, but also places where people organize and connect to other community efforts. And I'm putting up a picture here of a historic, she's one of the knowns of one of the grandmothers of the environmental justice movement, marching in 1982 against a toxic waste dump in her area with her 2-year-old daughter. So yeah, that's the idea. And I'm really eager to hear your responses.
Thanks so much, Anya. We will transition to questions, and I know there's already some interesting stuff going on in the chat. I'll take the first one, and then I think Antoine will move us through some others. I wanted to ask, you mentioned, Lois, some opportunities to support parents, Shaina, you as well. I wanted to ask specifically about sustaining engagement with families over time. What kinds of supports, what kinds of strategies really help create sustained engagement with parents in this issue? And Lois, Shaina, Anya, anybody can jump in here. But Lois, maybe you have some thoughts.
Yeah, the key to me is ongoing communication, using social media for those who have access, but also, you know, not forgetting those that everyone doesn't. That's something I think we do in our society. We forget that everyone does not have access to social media. And so being able to, you know, pull together community meetings, to be able to find those parents who want to organize and lead the effort. And being able to have something, if you see in the chat, someone had asked, what can we do? And I think part of it too is partnering with early learning groups like Moms Rising or NIAC or NACI, depending upon what part of the country you're in, and building advocacy platforms around environmental justice for children. Those are some of the things that folk that we can partner with to make it so that it is a movement and not just a 30-second blurb. So the key to me, again, is communication, getting the word out there, and connecting with people in an ongoing, and then also the urgency of it, right? Because if you think about it, this is one place where, let's say, the investment in the environment will trickle down from generation to generation. It will help us sustain our economy, will help us be able to improve the health outcomes of children, and will definitely help them with brain development. So I think just bringing all those things on the forefront will make a difference.
Great. Antoine?
Well,
Over to you.
great. I didn't know if Anna, you wanted to add anything to that at all? Anya?
Yes, just quickly. I think just adding to that relationships are really important. So people take action when they have someone who they trust, who they care about, who cares about them, who is in communication with them about this issue. It could be their pastor, it could be their teacher, or it could be a friend.
Excellent, excellent. And well, before I go, I'm going to let a couple other people go. I do have some questions, but let's go. Sharon, I think you had a question for Shaina. Sharon, can you hear me? If she can't, I will read it for her. She's Shaina, I think she said, given the popular culture's obsession on immediate gratification, today's economy, today's happiness, are there any words of wisdom that you could share to help orient our report towards those future generations? And Shaina, I think that's for you. You're on mute if. Shaina, can you hear me? You're on mute if you can. There we go.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Is a question in the chat?
Yes, yes. I'll read it again for you. It says, given the popular culture's obsession with immediate gratification, are there any words of wisdom that you could share to help orient our report towards those future generations?
I think having engagement with youth is really, I think art is a good key way to getting children involved in advocacy of environment, as well as like, I think I read that wrong. Sorry.
Hey, Sharon.
I apologize. This is Andy Garner. I'm using my wife's computer, so it came across as Sharon. So that was the confusion there.
Oh, got it. Okay.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm like, who's Sharon? Oh, that's me. I'm so sorry.
No
I'm using my
problem.
wife's computer. But that was my question, Shaina, was that you mentioned future generations in your talk, and I really appreciated your mention of future generations. And I'm just wondering, given our culture's obsession on immediate gratification, we're thinking about the here and now. What other words of wisdom could you say to help orient our report to look towards those future generations, which are just so important?
Let's see. I was like, where's the wisdom?
Yeah.
I think that, yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with like, we don't really teach our kids about the governance. Like we teach them about certain, like education has picked and choose what they want our children to learn. And the governance has to do a lot with our shaping of our community, especially when it comes to gentrification, that there's actually policies and that have been written that has gentrified our communities for generations. And just knowing how to express that to children. At certain age levels, they learn about governance. And if we can teach children at a younger age about governance in a community setting of making policy changes, I think that would really help children understand like what gentrification is about. And as well as like the food sovereignty is a great way of expressing gentrification, because the fact that a lot of our Black and Brown communities don't have access to food, fresh produce, in fact, and as well as we don't have that many community gardens that are accessible to our communities. And some of these urban gardens are being used at our schools, that even our schools don't have access to those community gardens. So I think where's the wisdom on around the gentrification? I think it would be like taking field trips, like a lot of students are gridlocked in the communities they are in and never experience the other communities that are outside these gridlock areas, to see that like there are greenery communities outside of these gridlock areas that we consider gentrification. And like being able to teach our early children about that firsthand would be like food sovereignty. I think food sovereignty is a big segue for our communities to learn about environment, as well as the plants that also heal our air that we breathe. And I think the more that we can have like diverse education in our communities with different voices that are teaching our communities. We have Spirit of the Sun in our community that has that teaches youth about food sovereignty in gentrified communities. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in our communities, especially those that are gentrified, to learn about climate change.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, I think you had a question here.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Anya has responded in the chat, but I'm curious about just how we navigate gender inequities when we're thinking about supporting parents. We know that, women and girls tend to be more impacted by climate change than men. There's some research that shows that, mothers are more concerned about climate change than fathers. And, I want to acknowledge that there's, many genders that our current systems of research don't capture well, but I'm wondering how we can think about supporting parents in, while also recognizing that parents are not impacted equally by this challenge of climate change, and that it's women and mothers who are often carrying a much heavier load on a lot of different fronts.
Well, Elizabeth, first I agree with what Anya shared, and Anya, I know it's important. There are some people that may not be able to see the chat, so what you wrote is really important. I hope you'll share it out. But the thing I can say is that we learned from COVID-19 pandemic and the number of women who had to leave the workforce to take care of their children. And I saw that, quite a bit working in early learning, and as well as being a member of the Greater Seattle Child Care Business Coalition. We're a group of about 50 childcare providers that meet weekly to talk about these issues. And, when COVID first started, we had to come together to figure out how to keep our doors open, because we do support the frontline workforce. And so in doing so, we could see firsthand what you're talking about, Elizabeth. And what we have found that what I think we need to do, or what we had to do, was come together and advocate for policies that support women, especially in the workforce, but then around climate change as well. Because again, it goes back to when we were closed for those 3 days, it was primarily our mothers who stayed home with the children. so being able to share those stories with our legislators, being able to ask for those and push, even higher ed to be able to do those research, those studies on how climate impacts women. And I think one thing we know, if everything else about our country, and when money talks, and so we can tie it into the economic devastation of climate change and the workforce, I think that that's when people will begin to pay more attention.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Just to sum what I said in the chat, as an organizer, I see an opportunity. Fathers, grandfathers, let's activate traditional masculine values and talk about being climate protectors and climate defenders, and activate that moral authority that they have as people who care for young children as well. So that's on the one side, because we know it's not, we're all affected by climate change, right? And men are affected by climate change. Fathers are affected by worrying about their children, and they can be activated on that. At the same time, we recognize the intersectionality of climate change for women, for people of all genders, as well as for people who are marginalized in so many different ways. And so how do we support them in being leaders and elevating their voices? It might be something as simple as providing childcare, right? When you plan a protest or you plan an action, making sure that people have mental health resources, because women, and this was seen during the COVID-19 pandemic as well, because of our historic and general time responsibilities as caregivers, as the hubs of social networks, we're so more heightened by the danger that we see that's happening to the people that we care about. And that impacts our own mental health. It causes toxic stress. We need support for that. And we also need support to get our voices heard.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Angie, I think you had a general question earlier. I'm not sure if you want to direct it.
Yeah, well, and Lois had addressed it in the chat, which was great. But my main one was just, do you have, for all the panelists, like one main suggestion that you think we should make as part of our task force recommendations?
Well, the one that I think that Anya and I had in common, and Shaina, I'm sure will chime in too, is funding to assist early learning providers convert sites to clean energy that's efficient and assists with indoor air quality. And then, my freebie will always be retaining and enhancing our urban tree canopy. That's a free outdoor filter, and they're beautiful, and they're homes to all sorts of wildlife that keep our children curious. So that's the biggest thing, I think, out of the list of the 4 things that I shared.
Okay.
I love that. I would add to that, helping parents overcome climate anxiety and the silence that comes with it by giving them the resources and the tools to start these conversations early, to build climate literacy, and to build active hope through climate action with their kids, for their kids, on behalf of their kids.
I want to just add something about food sovereignty, because as growing up in a Native community, especially in my own family, we look to water as an important source. That's part of our prayers and a part of what sustains life. And Natives always have like a close relationship with like nature and science. And growing up, we knew that like water was always like an essential resource to not only to our prayers, but to our life and our livelihoods in our communities, and how that sustains many beings, and not just human beings, but also the plant beings, as well as the insects and animals that all contribute to like the circle of life. And I think that would be interesting for early educations to have that concept of circle of life, concept of that we all contribute to the environment in some way or shape or form. And without each of these essential place markers that have an essential place in our universe, it's important for our students to also know that, and our young learners to appreciate life in that light. So that would be another something I would like to see in early education.
Thank you.
No, great. I have a couple questions. Please continue to add questions, but I'll ask a couple things. Anya, you mentioned a term. I want to make sure I understood it effectively, climate anxiety. So I thought that was very interesting. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, what that means and the impact of that?
Absolutely. Psychologists and other researchers are starting to recognize a specific form of anxiety that's arising in response to consuming news about climate change and also experiencing changes in our home environments and the landscapes that we love due to climate change. And so why is it helpful to separate out eco-anxiety from other forms of anxiety? Well, I think for two reasons. One is that it really helps us understand that mental health is not just an individual experience. You know, we've seen that among Gen Z, 75% are experiencing negative mental health impacts, including anxiety and depression, as a result of their consuming and feelings of overwhelm as a result of their consuming news about climate change. So this is no longer about one person's feeling, one person going to a doctor, one person getting medication. This is about something that affects everybody on the planet, and almost everyone on the planet is starting to have feelings in response to it. The second reason it's important to think about it as anxiety is that when we think about anxiety, we think about coping. And so coping actions that we take in response to climate anxiety can be the self-soothing types of actions, the deep breathing, the mindfulness, perhaps, therapy, perhaps even medication. But what's also super important when it's responding to actual things that are happening in our world, that we need to be taking action-focused coping. So we need to be doing things that directly address the problem. Otherwise, there is no resolution.
No, thank you. Diana, saw your hand go up.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up, Anya, on something that you had in your materials that we've sort of danced around a little bit here over the last few listening sessions, and that's the idea of early childhood systems, specifically those that are in the community, as hubs of community resilience, and the opportunity that we have with this report to highlight, of course, the opportunities for resilient individuals and investing in young children to build resilience, but also in investing in early learning as a critical part of community resilience that, for better or for worse, is likely to be necessary in the future that we're facing. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Of course, and I would love for Lois to speak up as well. We saw such a moving example of this with COVID, and in COVID, I myself interviewed early childhood center leaders and in-home care providers who, with so little information and almost no support, pivoted in figuring out how to put in these extraordinarily complex types of behaviors in order to try to keep their communities safe from COVID. And that included, obviously, disinfecting surfaces, promoting mask wearing, figuring out how to make mask wearing safe for toddlers, appealing for toddlers, to demystify it, to make it less scary, making little masks to put on the children's dolls and on their bears so that they would feel something that was familiar to them. And this was a public health crisis where these frontline workers had to improvise on the fly and use the latest science in a fast-changing environment to try to keep everyone safe and healthy. There's obvious applications here, but we have a chance to do it a lot better, because if you think about what are the behaviors that are going to keep us as a society safe and healthy, what is the knowledge that we need to have in the climate crisis? I believe it's a factor of information that we're providing to our young children in an age-appropriate way, developmentally appropriate way, as well as the types of behaviors that we're reinforcing in that early childhood setting that in a good world are going to carry over into the home environment and into the community environment as well.
Yeah, I guess I would just build on that a little bit to say that there's also the opportunity for family connections that are built in early childhood settings across and between families, across and between communities, that I think we should also be keeping in mind. The great roles that organizations like Lois's play in their communities in keeping families connected to other services and supports, I think is another space that we've talked about, that idea of community resilience. So just something I see us lean in on.
I really even working with children, I don't have anything to really add to what Anya just said. It's what we do every day. And it's so funny too, as I listen to you, and, that's where quality early learning environments come into play, because we instinctively do that, connecting our parents to the latest research. I was reading about how flight attendants want children to wear, all children have seatbelts, and that there's this air strap that they can purchase. And that's like 6 o'clock Saturday morning, and I'm sending out a message to my families, read this article. And it's the same thing around climate change and these other issues. If you have your child in a quality environment, we are going to focus on everything that's going on around us to keep our parents up to date. I think the key is, Diana, is being able to have the resources available, being able to have materials or a curriculum that can be easily distributed and replicated throughout our country. And again, that comes with, like I said, partnering with groups like NIAC or Moms Rising that have that national pulse, and other groups where we can be able to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A great transition for us to our final speaker. We're very honored to have Chelsea Clinton join us today, Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation. Chelsea works alongside the Foundation's leadership on early childhood initiatives such as Too Small to Fail, which supports families with the resources they need to promote early brain and language development. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, Diana, thank you so much. And I'm only sorry that I couldn't be here earlier. I actually was at Show and Tell at one of my kids' schools today. I was so honored to be like the show and tell. I beat out the teddy bear. It really felt like, thank you for the chuckle. I really felt like, I unlocked a great achievement this morning. Diana, I want to thank you and everyone for convening this important conversation, particularly today, given the increasingly dire news out of the United Nations IPCC report. And yet, kind of with that dire news, we do know what works to kind of mitigate climate change to help kind of better protect children. And I think collectively here, we certainly share the belief that we need to be marshaling all of our energy and intentionality and resources and networks to try to kind of move toward, putting those solutions into action. I certainly am also grateful to have learned that recently the upcoming COP28 will have a day dedicated to climate change and health for the first time, and really kind of be focusing on the very real effects of climate change on health. And I think all of us here hopefully can ensure that the youngest among us are part of that important kind of conversation and very much the center of the conversation, that we are focused on people who are especially vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. And we know that is particularly acutely true for our youngest kids everywhere around the world, although we also know that some are more vulnerable than others. And at Too Small to Fail, which Dana was kind enough to mention, we now for more than a decade have been working to really meet parents and other caregivers where they are, to help parents and caregivers be effective first teachers for their children, for their grandchildren, for their younger siblings, for their nieces or nephews. And we've been focused predominantly on, early brain development insofar as it relates to early numeracy and early literacy and early social emotional building. And yet we know that we have to be thinking about climate change, and we have to be helping parents understand why, as a parent, this is so acutely relevant to all of us, that we have even more at stake than kind of anyone, because of the effects of climate change, not only on our kids as they grow up in an increasingly warming world, but also on our kids today. And so we just look forward to working with all of you to kind of determine how best to kind of convey the messaging of the very real awareness that we hope parents and other caregivers can have as to why kind of climate change is something they need to worry about now and not just in the future, but also what they can do to better advocate and more effectively advocate for policies and practices to protect their kids and all our kids. This is certainly something that I feel very keenly as a mom of 3 little kids. I'm very happy to live in a city like New York that has tried to kind of make climate conscious decisions, often because of the pressure of many people like you and sometimes including you. But know that we all need to be doing more in our local communities, our local cities, our states, certainly across the United States, but also at a global level. So really just proud that we're part of this work. Look forward to continuing to learn with and from all of you. And I don't quite know who I hand the proverbial Zoom room back to, Antoine or Diana or someone else, but really just I'm proud to be here and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Antoine, I think I will go and thank all of our panelists, Lois, Anya, and Shaina, as well as Chelsea for joining us today. And I'll toss it back to you.
No, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate everyone's input. This was great, particularly this being our last one. Just want to thank you guys for this. Today's sessions marks the final public listening session of the Early Years Child Climate Action Task Force. The task force will now begin its work on drafting the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan, which we anticipate will be released this fall. Thank you guys so much. Everyone continue to be safe. Thank you for your contributions today.